There's by far one video that I've been requested more than any other video, and that is 5 reasons.
Now we're going to move to Dr. Soy Cooper, who, when we reached out with perfect civility and friendliness, replied with, you are a bad person because you question authoritative narratives. So nothing to do with any theology, nothing to do with anything to do with debate, nothing to do with any of the arguments. You're a bad person because you don't accept authority. And throughout the last 3 years, this soy man openly, consistently pushed that you get stabbies and that you do all the things that the system tells you to do. Right? But he's so righteous, so pious, and so beyond interacting with any of the dirty online apologists who are so mean. Well, let's see if he has any good arguments.
I'm not Eastern Orthodox. Now, I haven't done this yet for a particular reason. Well, a couple of reasons, I guess. One is it's kind of hard to do.
Note, of course, his Star Wars figurines on his shelf there, which we made quite a bit of a joke of because... I mean, I'm not going to let anybody who has a bunch of Star Wars figurines on his pristine, unused, and unread theology books on his shelf. Yeah, I'm going to call you soy, dude.
Because Eastern Orthodoxy does not have a strict catechism or something like what we have in the Roman Catholic Church or anything like the Westminster Confession of Faith and the Reformed tradition. So,
yeah, I'm pretty sure the Orthodox Church has plenty of catechisms. So from the outset, kind of a ridiculous statement. I mean, the Catechism Metropolitan Philaret is very well known. No idea where he got this idea or claim that the church doesn't have catechisms.
Really, anything I say in discussion or debate with Eastern Orthodoxy, it's always going to be brought up that they don't have an explicit statement about that issue. So it does become a little...
Yeah, that's not true. The idea that Orthodox Christianity doesn't have a specific dogma or statement about any issue that he brings up is just not true. So right away from the outset, Dr. Soy Cooper doesn't actually have any substance of what he's saying. I mean, these are kind of absurd statements from the outset. So I've not watched this video, but I don't get the impression that there's any interest in steel manning our position here. There's already kind of absurd claims from the outset.
More difficult when we're interacting. The second reason is just that a lot of people who I've talked to are considering becoming Eastern Orthodox, and they've asked me to do this video.
Well, now we see the real reason that he didn't want to engage, which there's always an excuse. And the excuses are, oh, he's a bad person and he is mean and he aggressively debates. Meanwhile, the same people that make those criticisms regularly engage with really mean and offensive people, have them on their channels, debate with them, but then have this idea that, no, it's actually Jay that is really the really mean guy. He's the one that you really can't interact with. So at that point, really all there is left to do is actually just make fun of these people. I mean, he looks like the soy meme.
Honestly, a short video on YouTube about the reasons why I'm not Eastern Orthodox is not going to convince you not to become Eastern Orthodox. I've done podcasts on the issue dealing with converts to Eastern Orthodoxy from Lutheranism, and I've written a book, Justification, on the topic of theosis. So if you want to really get in depth, I do have some resources that are going to be more in depth in this video, but since you have all been asking for it, I will give my personal 5 reasons why I am not Eastern Orthodox. So the first reason is the apophatic way of doing theology. Now, the apophatic way of doing theology begins with Pseudo-Dionysius and then develops throughout the Eastern tradition specifically.
The apophatic way, quote unquote, does not begin with Dionysius. There are plenty of theologians who use apophatic language in the Bible. So there's people like St. Paul, who speaks of negation in terms of the essence-energy distinction. The essence-energy distinction is bound up with apophatic theology. Philo was doing apophatic theology prior to anybody in the New Testament times. The theology of Moses, and Moses going up on the mountain and asking to see God in himself, and God saying essentially, I will show you my goodnesses, my back parts. I will not show you my face because it will kill you. That is apophatic theology. And the mainline scholarship on this topic on Philo, Aristotle, East and West by Dr. Bradshaw would let you know that if you actually listened.
But apophatic theology essentially is this. It says that the way that we know God is by discerning what he is not.
By the way, did you know that Plato and the pre-Socratics engaged in apophatic theology about the one? So literally no knowledge of the history of philosophy here, because apophatic theology is something that's fundamental in Hellenic thought and philosophy. It doesn't originate with Dionysius. No idea what he's talking about.
Rather than by positive propositions about his own nature or who he is. And so we know God by way of negation. Because
also, that's not true that apophatic theology means that we do not make any positive cataphatic statements about God. So a fundamental misunderstanding. Apophatic theology is about the essence. No positive statements about what the essence is. Cataphatic theology, which we do, and which all Orthodox theologians consistently discuss, from Staniloy to Losky to Meyendorf, etc., is about the energies. So the cataphatic statements refer to the energies, the operations or attributes or acts of God. The apophatic refers to the essence. So he's fundamentally wrong from the outset.
Human language is always limited and God's essence is unknowable. So the way we get closer to God and knowledge of God is by negating all human language and ways of speaking about God. And this plays into Eastern Orthodox spirituality in many ways. It is a large part of hesychasm. It's often the case that the kind of height of prayer is to have this wordless, even thoughtless prayer, and just being still in God's unknowability. And my problem with apophaticism isn't that it's inherently wrong to say God's essence is unknowable. Of course, God is transcendent. But in the Western tradition, God is known more by way of analogy. And this is something that...
So again, fundamental misunderstanding. The analogy is used by all the Cappadocians and the Eastern Church Fathers as well, but the application is to the energies. So it's an analogia energeia, not an analogia entis. And he also doesn't even know that the early Latin Church Fathers also use the same via negativa, as do even the post-Augustinian Latin Fathers using the via negativa. So does he even know that via negativa is common throughout Western medieval theology as well? Now, Western medieval theology is not consistent, but they do the via negativa. So does he even know what he's talking about?
St. Thomas Aquinas develops very, very thoroughly, is to say that we know God. He communicates himself to us through...
I mean, he just mentioned Aquinas. And by the way, he called him Saint Thomas Aquinas. So do Lutherans believe that Aquinas is a saint? Did Thomas Aquinas teach justification by faith alone? Now, I'm curious because, again, I don't believe that Aquinas is a saint, nor do I believe that he's consistent, but there's constant usage of the via negativa in Aquinas. So notice the fundamental misunderstanding from this soy man who loves to critique and attack us all the time. Well, he hasn't done it in a while, but he used to. Any fundamental understanding that Aquinas uses the via negativa? No, he just bypasses that and acts like that he doesn't, or that this is unique to the East. Fundamental lack of knowledge.
Means of analogy. In other words, he speaks to us in ways that we understand, and we understand him in the way that we would understand an analogy. So God speaks to us as good. He is...
All of the Eastern Fathers use analogical predication, just not to the essence. Again, doesn't know what he's talking about.
Loving, things like that. And there is an analogy between our love, our goodness, and that which belongs to God. So we understand him through those analogies, even though they're not definitive of God's essence, at least not in the way that we understand them. And that has to do with the relationship between attributes of this world and God's attributes. So that kind of leads us to a whole other discussion. But I would also point to that largely and primarily that the New Testament itself just points us, when it's speaking about our relationship to God, it points us to the person and work of Christ. And that's not to say that the Eastern Orthodox don't point to the person and work of Christ at all, but what I find is in kind of apophatic spirituality, there really is not enough emphasis where the New Testament places its emphasis, and where the New Testament places its emphasis is actually on the person and work of Christ.
Yeah, but a fundamental misunderstanding, because in the Orthodox Church, all of the divine energies are triadic, and so any cataphatic statement, which we do, and we do cataphatic theology, is an application of positive attribution to the divine energies, and every divine energy comes to us through the person of Christ. So fundamental misunderstanding. this idea that Orthodox theology is divorced from Christ is preposterous. I mean, I don't know. And he's picking out the emphasis of the New Testament, not even aware of the fact that Paul consistently uses energeia and the energies throughout the New Testament. This is a Pauline argument, right? It's the dunamis, the power of God at work in me, right? The Spirit gives and distributes his gifts, his energies, as he wills. So this is a Pauline argument. This person who is supposed to be a PhD hasn't even looked at what they always love, the PhD. Oh, go to the Greek. Let's go to the Greek. Oh, the Greek words. They don't even go to the Greek.
If we want to know who God is, we look at where God has revealed himself, and that is in the person of Christ. And so when we're speaking about how do we know God, Luther would point to Jesus, even the infant in the manger, saying, you need to know what God is like. Look at...
Yeah, Orthodox theology is not going to Jesus because we talk about the energies. Every energy is manifested from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit. And so you'll notice this Christocentric theology that is not triadic in Lutheranism, right? Now, obviously, the person of Christ is who we worship and who directs our worship then to the Trinity. But Lutheran theology is so Christocentric that it's actually the opposite. It's actually their system that is flopped over into a lack of clarity and a lack of triadic immersion. So they're not actually immersed in or knowing the Trinity. Jesus says that he came to point our worship to the Father. And the Spirit directs us to Christ, who then directs us to the Father. So the Orthodox conception is triadic, and that's the New Testament teaching. Not your Christolatry in the sense of only focusing on the person of Jesus. That's not actually authentic and Trinitarian. That's the Lutheran presuppositions that your cult has.
That baby Jesus in the manger. So in terms of how we explain God and how we generally approach theology, there's going to be a major difference. So that's the first reason that I'm giving. And the second reason I'm not Eastern Orthodox is the way that they express theosis. Now, this is the reason a lot of people ask me about this, because I'm a proponent of the doctrine of theosis. I've written a book on it. I've explained it in podcasts and videos and in different places. I think it's something that...
It's funny how so many of these people rip off what is Orthodox theology and try to paint it as this cool, also Protestantized option for you too. Yeah, there's like a Lutheran version of theosis, dude. Like you could believe that, and they're like, but check out Luther, he's cool too, even though he teaches Manichaeanism. Like it's all still cool, dude.
Very clearly in the Church Fathers, it's something that Scripture itself talks about. We are partakers of the divine nature. We really can't avoid that kind of language. But the way that theosis is expressed, especially in the Paulinite tradition in Eastern Orthodoxy, is something that I don't necessarily agree with. I think
I can already tell from what he has said in this lecture that he does not have any familiarity with the writings of St. Gregory Palamas, such that he is sufficient or capable to actually explicate this theology. So for him to critique it and say that he disagrees with it and that there's a Lutheran version of it and that he doesn't believe the, quote, Palamite tradition is already betraying his vast level of ignorance.
That the experiential way of looking at theosis in terms of a particular kind of experience draws largely from Neoplatonism, more so than it does the text of Scripture.
So again, this is just an often repeated low-tier critique that people who have no knowledge of the topic give, and that's that theosis is Neoplatonic. This is the word concept fallacy. This is a genetic fallacy, and it's a failure to understand fundamental ideas about the fact that the Church Fathers, in utilizing the energies doctrine, and we're talking about the Cappadocians here, letter 234 of Basil, for example, is intended to refute the Neoplatonic idea. The essence-energy distinction itself is situated historically and theologically in polemic works against simplicity-obsessed doctrines and heresies. In other words, when I read Nyssa and when I read Basil, whether it's against eunomianism or on the Holy Spirit, when the energies doctrine is present, and it's present in those treatises consistently, it is there to refute the simplicity arguments of people like Eunomius. And if you had read those people, you would actually know that. And you would know that the energies doctrine is not something made up by Palamas. It is not made up by Plotinus. Plotinus doesn't teach the energies doctrine. Our doctrine of theosis is a theosis on the basis of the essence-energy distinction. And if you read Dr. David Bradshaw's book, Aristotle, East and West, you will notice that the immersive apotheosis of Neoplatonism is nothing like the participatory theosis of the Bible. So he's admitting that the Bible teaches this. He assumes that the Cappadocians and Palamos teach something other than the Bible, which is Neoplatonism. This is all the more absurd given the fact that the Cappadocian argument, utilizing the essence-energy distinction, is to refute Neoplatonic doctrines of simplicity.
And so that's through the lens of Pseudo-Dionysius, Maximus Confessor, and others. And you'll look at someone like Vladimir Lossky and the way that he expresses these views. And this is something you find in some Eastern Orthodox articles even as well. Those who are scholars of theosis have often posited, and you can look at my book Christification where I cover this, but they've often posited that there are basically two different modes of looking at theosis. And there is one that is more redemptive historical in its core. And this is the one that you find in people like Saint Irenaeus, where you have this emphasis on...
How can you go?
So one thing that we should say here is that the fact that not every single church father who discusses the topic, the fact that they don't go into a vast discussion of the essence energies doctrine, does not mean that they're teaching different doctrines. It just simply means that that doctrine wasn't called into question with specificity until about the Middle Ages. So yes, it's true that we find pretty clear distinctions between in Irenaeus, the will of God and the acts of God. Athanasius makes a distinction between the acts of God and the nature of God. St. Cyril of Alexandria expands it to be more precise, to talk about the energies of God versus and distinct from the essence of God. I don't mean versus in a dialectical sense. I just mean in a distinction sense. We find this present in St. Cyril of Jerusalem as well. We find this in the Cappadocians, and they are talking about, in that context, refuting the simplicity doctrine of eunomius, which is based on Neoplatonism. 100%. Scholarly consensus on that, no doubt. I can point you to the literature if you want in the Discord. Now, by the time of St. Maximus, he's refuting Origenism, and he harkens back to the Cappadocians to refute Origenist ideas of apokatastasis and universalism and Neoplatonism. And he stresses and often talks about the essence-energy distinction, and we interviewed Dr. Torstein Tollefson on the essence-energy distinction and the Logi doctrine in Maximus. So again, one of the theses early on in that book is that Maximus modifies a Logi doctrine. So it is not the Neoplatonic doctrine. He makes them personal ideas of the Logos. That is not Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism does not teach that the nous or the mind is personal and that the Logi are personal. So he's acting as if, because Irenaeus and these people don't say everything that Palama said is absurd, or he's acting as if they don't teach it. But we shouldn't expect that, because the specific argument about the essence-energy distinction doesn't come up until Palamos and the triads and the arguments with Akindinos and the Barlamites. So of course we're not going to see a full-fledged defense of this doctrine because it's not being questioned.
Incarnation as redemptive, and in his incarnation we participate through him in these attributes that belong to God himself. Immortality and incorruptibility are the two that show up the most, and this is the way that it's expressed in St. Athanasius. And so we have a divide then between that and Pseudo-Dionysius, and the Eastern tradition has drawn from both to different degrees, and it depends.
Yeah, there's no divide there. Where does he get that there's a divide between a participation in the attributes in Irenaeus and the participation in Dionysius? If you'd read the divine names, you would know that he talks about the exact same idea of participation. And he calls the energies of the attributes processions. They're the divine processions. That's just the same thing as energies. Same idea.
On who the figure is in the school of thought, but largely drawn from the Dionysian view, which is more Neoplatonic in its view. So the view of theosis...
By the way, nobody disputes overlaps here, but the assumption is always that Neoplatonism is this thing that Christians cribbed from, as if Neoplatonism didn't crib from Christian thinkers or the Bible. We don't know exactly who was cribbing from who. The scholarship debates this stuff, right? We don't exactly know. But already we can tell that this guy doesn't actually know what he's talking about, because if he knew what apophatic theology was, he would know that Plato and the pre-Socratics used this type of theology. It wasn't done first by Dionysius.
I see in the New Testament, as well as in the earlier church fathers, is more economic in terms of the focus is on the economic redemption that has been accomplished in the incarnation of Jesus and what that does for our salvation. That doesn't mean there's no experiential
flip those hands
aspect
over as he
to
does
that
his
or
movement.
effect of that. But in its core, it is an economic reality, something that Jesus did and earned for us.
Right. So here we have a fundamental Trinitarian misunderstanding and mistake where he thinks that the energies are economic. Yeah, that's the Origenist view, because in the Origenist view, the world has to exist to actualize these ideas in God or in the divine mind, or to actualize the attributes. For example, if God is Father and is Creator, then for God to eternally be Creator, there must always be a creation. There must always be something that he's provident over, or else he's not provident. So he doesn't even realize that by restricting the energies to the economia, he is making the Origenist error.
The third is
this is why, by the way, Palamas debates, if you read the intra-Trinitarian debates that happened at the Crisis in Byzantium book, Papadakis, where at the Palamite synods this comes up, and the Palamite synods point out that you cannot restrict the energies to the economia, because that leads to Origenism. That's one of Origen's arguments. There is an eternal manifestation and procession of the energies irrespective of creation. St. Gregory of Palamas calls those the natural energies. That doesn't mean that the energies that relate to economia are unnatural, by the way, which is a dumb low IQ argument that people make. It just means that there are some energies that were not dependent upon the created order. For example, divine glory, right? Divine glory was always manifesting from the Father through the Son in the Spirit from all eternity, and it did not depend on a created order. And that divine glory is not synonymous with the divine essence, or else you're a modalist.
Of justification. I'm Lutheran, so very clearly I'm going to go back to the doctrine of justification. In my video on 5 reasons why I'm not Roman Catholic, I did the same thing there as well. So this is really going to be a core issue that keeps me Lutheran instead of my going either to Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, if I were to go one way or the other, it would be Eastern Orthodoxy without question. But nonetheless, there...
Right, so here we have a guy who is pretending to be quasi-Orthodox with his little man beard there, but at the same time, justification is more important for him than Orthodox theology. So in other words, notice the pattern here that nothing he has said so far has anything to do, strictly speaking, with triadology or Christology. He spoke a little bit about Christology in relation to the energies, but every time I've critiqued these kinds of Protestant presuppositions, I always point out that they have the wrong order of theology. Their theology puts soteriology first. And notice he did that in his video, right? For him, soteriology is the starting point of all theology. That's the Ordo Theologiae starting point for him. And that is just simply wrong. Your theology is Trinitarian and Christological, and that is what determines the soteriological. Isn't that obvious? Shouldn't it be obvious that soteriology flows from the person and work of Christ? But yet Lutherans, we find, start their theology with justification, with dialectics of grace and free will, and then tack on their Christology down the road, which is partly why Luther has a Christological heresy when it comes to the Eucharist, for example. But I just wanted to point out that in the world of Protestant theology several years ago, let's see when this came out, 2000, well, I have my copy from 2005, but this is a great book. This came out in the late 90s, 1998, I guess, maybe earlier than that in terms of, but the edition I have here is from the early 2000s, Justitia Dei by world-renowned, world-known Protestant philosopher, or history of theology, history of ideas guy, Alistair McGrath. Now, of course, every Protestant, I don't care what Alistair McGrath says. He's a fallible person. I don't have to submit to him. I don't care. So they don't care what any of their own Protestant scholars say until they want to use them, right? But he says, what's the whole thesis of this book? Nobody taught justification by faith alone until Luther. So it was a very devastating and kind of damaging book in the world of Protestantism. A lot of Protestants have chosen to sort of ignore it because it's a pretty damning admission that nobody taught the hinge of the gospel until the 1500s. And yet that's really the essence of this guy's position.
Still reasons why I'm not Eastern Orthodox, and justification is a large part of that.
Yeah, so in other words, I want my soteriology and my presuppositions about what I think the text means and my pet theories more than I want to be corrected or anything else, right? That's what this amounts to. And that's why this is a heresy, because it's not listening to the mind of the church, which for 1500 years didn't teach this goofy doctrine. And it's Luther's distinctive doctrine, and everybody in the world knows that. And Luther himself critiqued the church fathers for not teaching this doctrine. So when they do their quote minds, they're ignoring the fact that Luther laughed at the teachings of the church fathers for not teaching this.